Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to go on a bit of a diversion today. There's been lots happening in the NHS recently. We've had the Lucy Letby prosecution, which has been appalling. It's shown up huge problems with NHS management at every level. Then we've had the news that waiting lists have got even bigger. They've always been terrible, but it's even worse at the moment. And here we are, not even in winter. Things can only get worse, I'm afraid. What's even more appalling is the fact that people have been dying on waiting lists, waiting for investigations for serious diseases and also waiting for treatment. Things like hip and knee replacement, but also more serious procedures as well. The whole thing is dreadful. I've never known anything like it in all my time as an NHS doctor. I'm going to be speaking with a very good friend of mine, Bill Farren-Price. He's a very seasoned journalist. His expertise is in geopolitical matters, but like all of us, he's very interested in what's happening in this country at the moment, where there's failure everywhere we turn, from the top to the bottom, and it's all down to a failure of good leadership and a vision for this country. I hope you enjoy this. It's a bit different from what I normally do, but it interests me greatly what's happening in our world at the moment. If you'd like us to talk about anything in particular, then please leave comments below. If you'd like to get in touch and talk about anything to do with hip surgery, then the details will be in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all again next time.
Jeremy's decades of experience in the NHS and private health have given him a unique perspective on the dilemmas facing policymakers in the health field. And so we thought it would be valuable to dig into some of these issues on the pod. So let's dive straight in. I mean, Jeremy, looking at your videos and knowing you as well as I do, I've always been struck by your broad enthusiasm for medicine as a topic, and a profession, and it's sort of almost defined you as a person, your training, your professional activity. I'm going to kick off with one of those broad journalistic questions. There are obviously ups and downs in all careers, but what have been the greatest moments in your professional career as a doctor and a surgeon?
I think it's been a very satisfying career, but it's going to be 40 years since I qualified next year. And it's been an extraordinary time during that period of training and working in the NHS. I also worked in Australia for a while, so I was able to see different systems and how they manage the problems that we're all facing as healthcare professionals. But I suppose the highlights of my career being a consultant, being a fully trained consultant, and developing the skills to do hip surgery reliably and repeatedly. So I really find that very satisfying, being able to do that craft, that operation, which is hip replacement surgery, and refining it all the time. So that's been the most satisfying thing. But also looking after my patients. That's a huge part of being a doctor, not just a surgeon. But that's been the most rewarding and, of course, the most challenging thing of all, because you have this unique responsibility to put the care of your patients at the forefront of your duties. I mean, the duties of a doctor are to look after your patients first and foremost.
So if patient care is the thread that runs through all experiences from before the NHS to the current day, the NHS was a radical departure for the way that healthcare is set up in this country. And when you think of that radicalism, do you think we need a new dose of that in the present day to deal with the challenges that we face, by which I mean aging demographics, the advances of technology and pharma, and the requirements to keep an elderly population healthy?
Well, they're unique. Well, they are challenging. They're not unique. If you look at the history of the NHS before it was instigated in 1948, it was very much a disparate collection of healthcare providers. People didn't have free healthcare back then. Back in just before the First World War, Lloyd George brought in national insurance, and that was used to pay for GPs basically, but didn't care for their families, for people's families. So if you were working, you paid your national insurance stamp, you got looked after by a GP, but didn't cover your wife and children or your dependents. And so there were various voluntary and charitable organisations and municipal organisations which had hospitals and gave free healthcare to people. But it was ad hoc, and it wasn't really a coherent service. So it wasn't until really that the war was the catalyst, the Second World War was the catalyst for the modern NHS. And it was realised that the hospital service particularly needed to be redeveloped and transformed because it wasn't fit for purpose for the post-war generation, and so the hospitals were nationalised basically.
That must have been challenging for doctors at the time who had been used to private practice and the benefit and the financial benefits of that was suddenly being required to work for the state.
Yes.
At presumably lower fees.
Well, that was a huge challenge, and if you look at the history again of the NHS and the way that it was developed from the Beveridge report in 1943, and then of course Nye Bevan was the man who set it in place. But it wasn't just a sudden event; it was an evolution of a number of different threads being pulled together. But Nye Bevan famously said in the 1950s that in order to get the NHS through the British Medical Association, the Doctors' Union, he had to stuff the doctors' mouths with gold because doctors were making a good living out of medicine. A lot of them had most of them would have private practices, but they did a lot of pro bono work as well. So they'd have their private practice, but then they would go to the municipal hospitals, the cottage hospitals, and provide their services there. And in order to get the consultants on board, they had to negotiate a fairly complicated contract with them to allow them to continue to do private practice as well as to be employed by the NHS.
That's interesting. I mean, coming up to the modern day, doctors' pay is obviously an issue that's very much in the headlines at the moment. Do you think that there's a need for some sort of reset in terms of the relationship between the state and doctors, not just on pay, but possibly also, as you know, in terms of efficiency and management?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the pay of public sector workers, it really hasn't kept up with inflation over the last 15 to 20 years. So there's understandably a disgruntlement by the people employed by the state because they feel their wages haven't kept up with inflation and the cost of living. But that's not just doctors and nurses, it's across the board. But the reality is there isn't more money. We're already paying the highest levels of taxes we have done for decades. And if you look in the news at the moment, there is no more money. And people are very reluctant to dig in deeper to pay more tax. But on the other hand, how would you provide a service, as you said, to an ageing demographic with not that fewer people being born these days? So there isn't the young population coming through to pay the pensions of us baby boomers and the people coming up to retirement, but also who's going to be the doctors and nurses of tomorrow. So I think this is the moment where things have to be dealt with robustly, and there has to be almost a revolution in the way we deliver healthcare.
So more radicalism then?
I think so, yes, because without that, things are just going to blunder on as they've done for the last, throughout my working career in the NHS. There's always been this recognition that with the increasing costs of medical technology, with a rising population and an ageing population, the sums just don't add up. So there has to be either more money, and there's more money in the NHS now than there ever has been in terms of spending. So that's not really the issue. Efficiency, well, how do you make it more efficient? There are several ways of doing that. You make people work harder, but look at the morale in the NHS already. People aren't going to do that without being paid a lot more, having better conditions at work. You could make the workforce less expensive by not training them as much and lowering their expectations. But is that really what we want as a population?
Well, I've got a suggestion for you. I mean, you were qualifying as a doctor in the mid-'80s, just after the Thatcher reforms that introduced a new layer of administrative management into the NHS. How about we thin down that management structure? Because you only have to look at the Letby case to see that there are some severe challenges emerging in terms of conflicts of interest when you have a difficult situation, whistleblowing, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Possibly that's an area where you could slim down cost.
Yeah, it's very interesting. If you look back at the Thatcher era, in 1983 there was the Griffiths report, and that really was a pivotal moment in the development of the modern NHS, because before then the Hospital Management Board was really a medical director, a senior administrator, the matron, and various people running different departments. So they were there to facilitate the work of the doctors and nurses. They ran the estates, personnel, payroll, but they were there just to support the running of the hospital. The Griffiths report, which was brought in by Thatcher, really transformed management, brought in a professional cadre of management, hospital management, and people were brought in from outside industries. And it was really throwing down the gauntlet to the traditional method of running a hospital, and it upset a lot of consultants at the time, many of whom were my mentors who trained me. So I sort of had a flavour of what the NHS was like when they were training and when they became consultants, and that I took on those sort of attitudes to a certain extent. So my generation was the bridging generation between those post-NHS new medical students, trainee doctors, and my generation, which learnt from that generation, which straddled the different systems. And so I think it's been uniquely difficult to get doctors on board with modern management techniques. And understandably, when you see things like the Letby case and other disasters that have happened in the NHS, you wonder how have those new ways of managing the NHS actually benefited the people using the services, and what lessons can you learn from that? And as you say, should we go back to the more traditional model of doctors running the hospitals? The problem with that is most doctors aren't good managers. We're very good at what we do, and how do you engage and train those doctors to take on significant managerial roles in a very politicised system?
The private health sector, of course, is famously efficient, and that's how it makes its money.
Yeah.
Are there not some learnings to be had from the private sector, greater involvement in specialist support, staff, IT, all that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a private sector works very efficiently, but really for a limited number of cases. So for what I do, hip replacement surgery, it is a production line and it lends itself very well to that. What the private sector doesn't have is the depth of acute care that the NHS has. So if you have a serious medical complication after hip replacement in a private hospital, we often have to send you out in an ambulance to the local trust. There are arrangements in place to do that, and that's how it works. But if you've got other medical problems, you're better off within an NHS hospital where there is that support available. And the problem is, if you bring the private sector model and develop that further, how are we going to support the needs of those patients with complex medical problems, which are getting more and more of a problem because as we get older, we're operating on people who are less robust. So we need systems in place to be efficient in delivery of surgery, but also to be able to support those people should they have medical problems.
And I guess, of course, you've got the training issue as well, which is that you need to have an environment that is appropriate for training the next generation of surgeons.
Exactly. So if I'm doing the surgery, I can do several joint replacements a day. If I have to take a trainee through the process of learning the apprenticeship model of surgery, which works extremely well, you allow the trainee to do little bits of the operation under supervision. When you feel that they're competent enough to do the whole thing, you allow them to do it. But that takes time. It may take twice the amount of time it would take me to do a hip replacement to allow a trainee to do that. And therefore the problem is that you're building in inefficiency into a model which depends on really tight efficiency.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, so whatever new departure, wherever we get to in terms of the public debate on health, we still need to make some structural adjustments to the system to make it, to sustain it and make sure it's durable for the coming decades.
Yes, and I think we can learn from other countries. Other countries do this better than we do. I mean, if you look at Europe, France, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, they all have these hybrid models of healthcare where there is a state insurance which covers people who can't afford it. But for those who are earning, there is insurance top-up contributions. You have private providers doing a lot of the healthcare. So there is competition between private providers. That drives down costs and improves efficiency. But it also pays for the training of the new surgeons as well. So I think there's a lot we could learn from systems which are doing better than us.
What, just coming bang up to date and looking at the sort of health headlines that we tend to see at the moment, waiting lists is a massive one. Now, I know that the context of very long waiting lists is the COVID crisis and the impact that had on normal business as usual in hospitals. What is your instinct in terms of how to address this, how to ramp up capacity? It's almost a sort of one-off blitz that has to happen, the wartime spirit almost, to get this sorted, so that you can get back to some sort of level playing field moving forwards. It's a difficult one to figure out, but perhaps you, with the sort of clinical understanding as well as the institutional understanding, would have a better clue of how to address this.
So if I knew the answer, Bill, I'd be there trying
Secretary
to deliver
of
it.
State.
Exactly. And the problem is there has been very piecemeal workforce planning in the NHS for as long as I've been working in it. There has never been an overall strategy of how to balance the needs of a growing population with increasing healthcare demands with robust workforce planning. It's always been ad hoc. Different governments come and go, they pick the ball up, see it's too difficult and drop it. And there are all these massive competing influences between the royal colleges, physicians, surgeons, ophthalmologists, anaesthetists, the General Medical Council, the politicians and the people on the ground doing the work. And there's no clear vision. I think that's the real problem for the NHS. The vision was there at the end of the war, to have a unified health service, free at the point of care, that would provide healthcare from cradle to grave, but also not just providing good healthcare, but also preventative medicine as well. And that was the idea. You look after people from early on, and you prevent a lot of diseases. So therefore, the health service is able to cope. And since that vision in the 1940s, it's been just diluted over the years because it's so difficult to manage it. And that's the problem. There is no clear vision at the moment that will allow the service to transform in the way it needs to do so for the next 50 years.
It almost needs a royal commission or something to bring all these disparate bodies together.
Yes.
I sense, I agree with you, I sense no appetite among any of the political parties to move beyond the mantra that the NHS is a national treasure that needs to be preserved, but there's no great thought beyond that.
Well, if you look at politics at the moment, it's broken. You know, the way things have been managed with post-Brexit, that's a classic example of failing to deal with the problem. We've got the problem of massive numbers of people coming into this country, unchecked, unknown, with no resources to deal with them. The education sector's under great strain. So every facet of what is happening in this country is not being managed properly at a senior political level, as far as I can see. And there's a general election looming next year, so it's almost as if the current crop of politicians are thinking, well, it's too difficult to manage now, there's nothing we can do about it, let's just forget about it until the general election, then the next lot can have a go at it. And that's been the problem over decades, I think, in this country. It's been managed decline rather than clear visions which will allow people to engage with what needs to be done.
Yeah, I just to wrap up, I think we've only scratched the surface of some of these topics, but I want to finish with one thought for you to respond to, and that is the need for a proper, fulsome public debate. It's not, by the way, just on health policy, it's on AI, it's on a bunch of complex issues, and often you find that it seems as though the reason that policymakers don't advance the argument very far is because they're too concerned to capture the political headlines, which is usually about a debate that's 20 years old. In other words, the public debate is simply not progressed enough. And I think people like you probably have a role to play in that, and this sort of podcast does as well.
I think you're right. I think the more people who are actually on the ground delivering healthcare and seeing what the problems are from day to day, getting them involved more is hugely important. The trouble is, the people like me aren't particularly interested in getting involved at a level that's only, other than my own local level. It takes an enormous amount of effort and drive and determination to get to in front of the people who are making decisions, and it's not something that I have the time or the inclination to do, and one relies then on the leaders of one's profession to do that. But clearly it's not working.
No.
People are distracted by other things, net zero,
Well,
the climate catastrophe. In all these things, people make huge sound bites about them, go and travel overseas and say, yes, the world's burning. But actually, most people aren't, they're obviously concerned about it, but what interests them day to day is, how can I get my hip replacement done? How can I get my cancer diagnosed within the next few weeks so that I can get my life sorted out? I don't really care whether the carbon dioxide's going up or down. I just want to know that I'm going to get my hip replaced in a timely manner.
Well, I think you're pointing to the fact that politics is a short-term business, and when we are focused on the next few weeks and months, not net zero, which is a 2050 affair or 2030 affair,
Exactly.
or indeed healthcare and the shape and size of it in the 2030s and 2040s, but ultimately, I wouldn't call it an intellectual deficit, but there's definitely a leadership deficit here, and it needs to be addressed. Anyway, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. We've moved between the foundations of the NHS and the modern day challenges facing the NHS, and I would like to thank you very much for inviting me on, and it's been great to discuss it. Thank you very much.
But it's been a pleasure to have you on. We look forward to our next episode and instalment of this. I think there's so much we can discuss, which I think is hugely topical, hugely interesting to people who have healthcare problems or are looking after people with healthcare problems. We're all going to be patients one day. We all have a vested interest in making this work. So thanks for coming along. Look forward to the next one. And to all of you, thank you for watching. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below. And I'll see you all again next time.